3 days after we buried Gregor, Sloane cornered me in the library of the Greenwich mansion. I was standing by the window, looking out at the garden where her father had planted white roses every spring for the past 18 years. One for each year of our marriage. The irony of that wasn't lost on me as I heard her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step deliberate and measured like a prosecutor approaching the witness stand. I didn't turn around. I'd learned over nearly 2 decades that facing Sloane head-on only gave her more ammunition. She fed off confrontation, thrived on the moment she could see her words land and wound. So I kept my eyes on those roses, their petals already browning at the edges without Gregor's careful attention. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice had that sharp edge I knew so well, the one that cut through every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every attempt at civil conversation over the years. About the estate. About what happens next. "The lawyers will handle everything," I replied quietly, still not turning. "Your father left very clear instructions." I heard her laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It never had been, not in all the years I'd known her. When she was 17 and I first entered her life, that laugh had been a weapon of teenage cruelty. Now, at 35, it had been honed into something far more dangerous, something calculated and cold. "My father's instructions," she repeated, and I could hear her moving closer. I could smell her perfume, something expensive and aggressive that she wore like armor. "You mean the instructions you whispered in his ear while he was dying? While he was vulnerable and medicated and not thinking clearly?" That made me turn. I couldn't help it. The accusation was too vile, too calculated to ignore. When I faced her, I saw exactly what I expected. Triumph, dancing in her eyes. She'd wanted this reaction. She'd been baiting me for it. "Your father was completely lucid until the moment he died," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I pressed them against my side so she wouldn't see. "The heart attack was sudden. There was no lingering illness, no medication that clouded his judgment. You know that." "Do I?" She stepped closer, invading my space in a way that made my chest tighten. "Or is that just another story you've perfected over the years? Poor Callista, the grieving widow. Poor Callista, who gave up everything for love. Poor Callista, who never asked for anything." I wanted to walk away. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the room, to refuse to engage with her poison. But something kept me rooted there. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that I'd spent 3 days planning a funeral, greeting mourners, holding myself together while my heart shattered into pieces, and I simply had no energy left to run. "What do you want, Sloane?" I asked tiredly. Her smile widened. It didn't reach her eyes. It never did. "I want you to understand something," she said, and her voice dropped to something almost conversational, almost friendly. That made it worse somehow. "My father may have married you. He may have put a ring on your finger and let you play Lady of the Manor for 18 years, but that doesn't make you family. That doesn't make you a Mountgroff." I felt Dashiell shift beside me. I hadn't even noticed him entering the room. But there he was, my son, his jaw tight and his hands clenched into fists. He'd been hovering close since the funeral, protective in a way that broke my heart because it meant he'd seen how his sister treated me all these years. He'd witnessed the casual cruelty, the deliberate slights, the constant undermining. "Sloane," he started, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Stay out of this, Dashiell. This is between your mother and me." The way she said, "your mother," made it sound like an insult. Like the fact that I'd given birth to him somehow diminished me rather than elevated me. "Actually," Dashiell said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it, "it's not between you and Mom. It's between you and reality. Dad left a will. Lawyers will execute it. That's how this works." "Oh, I'm counting on the lawyers," Sloane said, and that smile was back, sharper than before. She turned her full attention to me, and I saw something in her face that made my stomach drop. This wasn't just anger or grief, or even the usual resentment. This was triumph. She thought she'd won something. My father may have married you, but when he died, you became nothing. Each word was carefully enunciated, designed for maximum impact. You're going to end up on the street like a dog, and the only thing you'll walk away with is his death certificate. The words hung in the air between us. I heard Dashiell suck in a sharp breath, felt him move toward his sister, fury radiating from him in waves. But I put my hand on his arm gently, stopping him. My fingers were steady now. The shaking had stopped the moment she'd revealed her hand. Because I recognized this for what it was, not just cruelty, not just the culmination of 18 years of resentment. This was Sloane's opening salvo in what she believed would be a battle over Gregor's estate. She thought she had leverage. She thought she had power. She thought I was vulnerable. She had no idea how wrong she was. But I wasn't going to tell her that. Not yet. Not when silence was so much more powerful than words could ever be. I looked at her for a long moment, studied her face, the certainty written there, the absolute conviction that she'd finally found the words that would destroy me. I saw her father in her features, the strong Mountgroff jawline, the aristocratic nose. But I also saw Elspeth there, the first wife, the ghost that had haunted this house and this family for 2 decades. The woman Sloane had spent half her life idealizing and the other half using as a weapon against me. "Are you done?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She'd expected tears, maybe, or anger, or desperate pleas for understanding. She'd expected me to fight back, to defend myself, to engage with her poison. The fact that I wasn't doing any of those things clearly unsettled her. "I'm just getting started," she said, but some of the confidence had leaked from her voice. "Then I'll leave you to it." I turned toward the door, Dashiell still beside me. "The lawyers have scheduled a meeting for day after tomorrow to begin the estate process. I assume you'll be there." "Count on it," she spat at my back. I didn't respond, just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, maintaining my composure until I was out of the library and halfway up the grand staircase. Only then did I let myself lean against the banister, pressing my forehead against the cool wood, trying to steady my breathing. Dashiell's hand found my shoulder. "Mom," he said softly. And there was so much pain in that one word. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with her. Dad just died and she's acting like someone who's scared," I finished for him. I lifted my head, looked at my son, this beautiful man who had his father's kindness and I hoped my resilience. "She's terrified, Dashiell. She just lost her father, the only parent she had left, and she's lashing out because pain makes people cruel. That doesn't excuse it." His voice was fierce, protective. "The things she said to you, I know." I straightened, smoothed down my black dress, the one I'd worn to the funeral and hadn't had the energy to change out of yet. "But I'm not going to fight with her. Not now. Not like this." "Why not?" The question burst out of him, frustration and confusion mixing together. "Why do you let her treat you this way? You've always let her treat you this way." "Because I loved your father," I thought, but didn't say. "Because Gregor asked me to be patient with her, to understand her pain, to give her time to heal. Because I knew what it was to lose everything, and I couldn't bring myself to take away the one thing she had left, even if that thing was hatred for me." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I kissed Dashiell's cheek and told him I was tired, that I needed to rest before the lawyer meeting. He watched me climb the rest of the stairs with worried eyes, and I knew he'd be thinking about this conversation for hours, trying to understand why I wouldn't defend myself. He couldn't know yet, couldn't understand that sometimes the strongest defense is silence, that sometimes the best response to cruelty is to let it echo in emptiness until the person who spoke it has to confront the ugliness of their own words. I went to my bedroom, the master suite that Sloane had made clear she thought I didn't deserve, and closed the door behind me. Only then did I let the facade crack. Not with tears, surprisingly. I'd cried myself dry over the past 3 days. Instead, I felt something else settling over me. Something that felt almost like peace. Sloane thought she'd won. She thought she'd reduced me to nothing with her words. She thought that death certificate comment was the killing blow. She had no idea what Gregor had left in his private safe. The one in his study that only he and Dashiell knew the combination to. The one that Dashiell would open tomorrow morning before the lawyer meeting, following his father's specific instructions. I sat on the edge of the bed Gregor and I had shared for 18 years and looked at the framed photo on my nightstand. It was from our wedding day, me at 39, looking hesitant and hopeful. Him at 56, looking at me like I was the answer to prayers he'd been afraid to voice. Behind us in the photo, barely visible, was 17-year-old Sloane, her face a mask of controlled rage. I kept my promise, I whispered to the photo. I never told her. I let her think whatever she wanted to think about me. I stayed silent like you asked. I touched the glass gently. But tomorrow, Gregor, tomorrow she's going to learn the truth, and I don't know if that's going to heal her or destroy her. The next morning came too quickly. I heard Dashiell moving around downstairs early, much earlier than necessary for the lawyer meeting. I knew what he was doing. Following his father's instructions. Opening the safe. Reading the documents that would change everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the sound. It came from Gregor's study, carrying through the old house with terrible clarity. A scream, not of pain, not quite. Something worse than that. Something that sounded like a soul being torn apart. My hands froze on the coffee pot. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because I knew that sound. I'd heard it before, 27 years ago, when I'd gotten the call that my parents had died in a car accident. The sound of someone's reality shattering completely. The sound of discovering that everything you believed was a lie. I set down the coffee pot carefully and walked toward the study. Each step felt like walking through water, slow and heavy and inevitable. The door was open. Dashiell was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, his hands literally tangled in his own hair, pulling at it like he could physically remove the information that had just entered his brain. "Mom," he whispered when he saw me in the doorway. His face was wet with tears. "Mom, you need to see this. Sloane needs to see this. She..." His voice broke. "She doesn't know. She has no idea. Oh God, she doesn't know what she's done." I looked at the papers scattered around him. Legal documents, bank statements, contracts from 15 years ago, a letter in Gregor's handwriting, pages and pages of it. And I understood why my son was sitting there trying to tear his own hair out. Because in that safe, Gregor hadn't just left a will. He'd left the truth, the whole truth. Everything I'd kept silent about for nearly 2 decades, thinking I was protecting his daughter's feelings, protecting his family's peace. He'd left proof that I wasn't the gold digger Sloane believed me to be. He'd left evidence that I'd saved his company, saved this house, saved everything the Mountgroff name stood for. He'd left documentation that the woman Sloane had spent 18 years hating was the same woman who'd tried to save her mother's life. And tomorrow, in that lawyer's office, with witnesses and legal documentation, Sloane was going to discover that when she'd called me a dog who'd only get a death certificate, she'd been attacking the woman who legally owned 51% of everything she thought she was fighting for. I knelt beside my son on the floor of his father's study, surrounded by the paper trail of a marriage and a sacrifice and a love story that Sloane had never believed was real. "Tomorrow," I said softly, gathering the papers with steady hands. "Tomorrow, everything changes." I met Gregor Mountgroff 19 years ago at a Christie's auction in London. I remember the exact date because it was my 39th birthday and I'd promised myself I was going to buy something extravagant to celebrate. Something that had no practical purpose except to make me happy. I'd spent the previous decade building my business from nothing, and I felt like I'd earned the right to be frivolous for once. The piece I wanted was an 18th-century Belgian escritoire, intricately carved with scenes from classical mythology. It reminded me of my grandmother's house in Bruges, of afternoons spent tracing those old carved patterns with my fingers while she told me stories. I was prepared to go up to £50,000 for it. Gregor outbid me at $75,000. I was furious. Not because I couldn't afford to go higher, I could have, but because he'd bid with such casual indifference, like the money meant nothing to him, like he was buying a coffee, not a piece of art. I watched him from across the auction room, this tall American man in an impeccably tailored suit, and I decided I disliked him intensely. After the auction, he found me in the gallery lobby. I was studying another piece, trying to console myself with the possibility of a different purchase. He walked up beside me and said, "I'm sorry about the escritoire. I didn't realize you wanted it that badly." "How could you possibly know what I wanted?" I asked without looking at him. My English was still heavily accented back then, and I was self-conscious about it. "I watched your face when they brought it out," he said simply. "You looked at it the way people look at things that remind them of home." That made me turn to face him. He was older than I'd thought from across the room, probably late 50s, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. But he wasn't smiling then. He looked genuinely apologetic. "My grandmother had one similar," I admitted. "In Belgium. I wanted to buy it for my office." "You're in business?" he asked, and there was real interest in his voice, not the condescending curiosity I'd gotten used to from men who assumed a woman at an auction was spending her husband's money. "Import antiquities," I told him. "European pieces for American buyers. I have a warehouse in Manhattan and showrooms in 3 cities." We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his real estate empire, the commercial properties he developed across the northeastern United States. I told him about building my business from a single shipping container of Belgian furniture I'd sold from my apartment 7 years earlier. We discovered we both loved opera, both hated pretentious wine culture, both had lost parents young and learned to stand on our own feet earlier than we'd wanted to. When we finally left the gallery, he asked if I'd have dinner with him. I said yes without hesitation, which wasn't like me at all. I was normally cautious with men, especially wealthy ones who seemed too interested too quickly. "The escritoire is yours, by the way," he said as we were parting to go change for dinner. "I'll have it shipped wherever you want." I stared at him. "I can't accept that. It cost you £75,000. "Consider it a birthday present," he said with a smile. "You mentioned it was your birthday. And besides, I only bought it because I saw how much you wanted it." Seemed like a good way to get your attention. "You spent £75,000 to get my attention?" I didn't know whether to be flattered or horrified. "I'd have gone to 100, he admitted. "You have extraordinary taste. And the way you talked about your business, the passion in your voice. I wanted to know you better. This seemed like the most efficient method." That should have been a red flag. The extravagance, the casual wealth, the assumption that money could buy anything, including someone's attention. But there was something disarming about his honesty. He wasn't trying to impress me with his wealth. He was just being practical in a way that made perfect sense to him. Our first dinner turned into a weekend together. The weekend turned into regular transatlantic calls. Within 3 months, I was flying to Connecticut every other weekend. Within 6 months, we were talking about marriage. That's when he told me about Elspeth. We were walking through his property in Greenwich, the mansion that would eventually become my home. It was early spring, and the gardens were just starting to bloom. He stopped by a bed of white roses and told me his first wife had planted them, that she'd died of ovarian cancer 3 years earlier, that she'd fought for 18 months with every treatment available, and he'd spent nearly $3 million trying to save her. "I have a daughter," he said quietly, still looking at the roses. "Sloane. She's 17. She was 14 when her mother got sick, 16 when Elspeth died. It destroyed her. Of course it did, I said, my heart aching for this girl I hadn't met. That's such a vulnerable age to lose your mother. She's angry, Gregor continued. At the world, at God, at cancer. And if I'm honest, she's angry at me too. For not saving her mother. For not somehow preventing this thing that couldn't be prevented. He finally looked at me. If we do this, if we get married, she's going to be angry at you too. For not being Elspeth, for being alive when her mother isn't. I would never try to replace her mother, I said firmly. I know that. But Sloane won't see it that way, not at first. Maybe not ever. He reached out and took my hand. I need you to know what you'd be walking into. It won't be easy. She'll test you, push you away, say cruel things, and I'll try to protect you from it. But there's only so much I can do. She's grieving, and grief makes people irrational. I thought about it carefully. Thought about the complications, the emotional minefield, the challenge of entering a family still raw with loss. The smart thing would have been to walk away. To find someone less complicated, someone whose life didn't come with so much baggage and pain. But I'd fallen in love with this man. With his kindness, his intelligence, his fundamental decency. The way he looked at me like I was remarkable just for existing. The way he listened when I talked about my business like my success mattered as much as his did. I want to meet her, I said. Before we make any decisions, I want to meet Sloane. The meeting did not go well. Gregor arranged dinner at a restaurant in Manhattan, neutral territory. Sloane showed up 30 minutes late, wearing all black like she was in mourning, which I suppose she still was. She was beautiful in that sharp, dangerous way of teenage girls who've learned to weaponize their pain. She had her father's dark hair and strong features, but her eyes were different, lighter, and I would later learn they were her mother's eyes. She barely spoke through dinner, answered questions in monosyllables. When Gregor mentioned we were thinking about getting married, she set down her fork with deliberate precision and looked directly at me for the first time all evening. How long after my mother died did you meet my father? She asked. Her voice was perfectly polite, perfectly controlled. That made it worse somehow. About 3 months, Gregor answered when I hesitated. 3 months, she repeated. Mom was gone 3 months and you were already replacing her. Sloane, Gregor said sharply, but I put my hand on his arm. I'm not trying to replace your mother, I told her gently. No one could replace her. I know how much your father loved her, how much you loved her. I'm someone who cares about your father very much, and I'd like to get to know you, if you'd let me. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she stood up, picked up her purse and said, I need to go. I have homework. She left without saying goodbye. Gregor tried to apologize, but I stopped him. She's 17 and her mother just died. This is exactly the reaction we should have expected. We got married 4 months later. Small ceremony, immediate family only. Sloane came because Gregor insisted, but she stood at the back of the room with her arms crossed, radiating hostility. In our wedding photos, you can see her in the background, a dark blot on what should have been a happy day. I tried with her. God, I tried. I asked about her classes, her friends, her plans for college. I left space for her grief, never pushed too hard, never demanded affection or even acknowledgement. I just tried to be present, to be steady, to be someone she could eventually trust if she ever decided to give me a chance. She went to Columbia and barely came home. When she did visit, she was coldly polite to me and warm only with her father. She refused to call me anything except my father's wife, like using my name would somehow legitimize my presence in her life. When I got pregnant with Dashiell 2 years into our marriage, I thought maybe that would help. Maybe a sibling would give Sloane something to focus on besides her resentment. And to her credit, she was never cruel to Dashiell. She loved him in her way, though there was always an edge to it. A sense that she saw him as proof that her father had moved on, had built a new family, had replaced what they'd had before. The first real crisis came during the financial collapse of 2008. Gregor's company was heavily leveraged in commercial real estate development. When the market crashed, he had 3 massive projects suddenly underwater. Banks were failing, credit was frozen, and he was staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. He tried to hide it from me at first. Masculine pride, I suppose, the need to protect me from worry. But I ran a business too. I understood financial statements. I saw the stress eating at him, heard the late-night phone calls with lawyers and accountants. One night I found him in his study at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. He looked up at me with exhausted eyes. "Bad. If I can't secure capital in the next 30 days, I'm going to lose everything. The company, this house, 20 years of work, everything." I went to my office and pulled out my financial statements. The business I'd sold 2 years earlier when we got married. The money I'd invested conservatively. The $12 million I'd put aside for security, for independence, for the future I thought I was building. I transferred it all to Gregor's company account the next morning. "What did you do?" he asked when he saw the transfer, his face white with shock. "I invested in your company," I said simply. "I believe in you. I believe in what you've built. And I'm not going to watch you lose it when I have the means to help." He cried. This strong, proud man sat in his office and cried, and I held him while he did. Later, he insisted on making it legal, on giving me proper contracts, equity shares, documentation of every penny. He wanted to protect me just like I was protecting him. We never told Sloan. He wanted to, but I stopped him. "She already thinks I married you for money," I said. "If she knows I gave you $12 million, she'll just twist it into something else, some scheme I'm running. Let's just keep this between us." That decision, made to protect his daughter's feelings, would haunt me for the next 15 years. The $12 million saved 3 key properties and gave Gregor the breathing room he needed to restructure his debt. Within 18 months, the company was stable again. Within 3 years, it was thriving. The commercial real estate market recovered, and Gregor's carefully positioned properties became some of the most valuable assets in the Northeastern Corridor. By 2012, his company was worth more than it had ever been, nearly $200 million in total assets. And I owned 51% of it. Not that anyone knew that except Gregor, his personal attorney Richard, and the accountants who managed the corporate structure. To the rest of the world, including Sloan, I was just the wife who'd conveniently retired from her own career to support her husband's success. The woman who hosted dinner parties and attended charity galas and looked elegant on Gregor's arm at corporate events. Sloan's resentment grew more sophisticated as she got older. The teenage anger matured into adult coldness, more calculated and therefore more painful. She graduated from Columbia with honors and built a successful career in public relations, representing Manhattan's elite. She was brilliant at her job, manipulating narratives and managing reputations for clients who paid her extraordinary amounts of money to make their problems disappear. She never turned that skill toward making me disappear from family narratives, though she certainly tried in subtler ways. At family gatherings, she'd tell stories about when it was just me and Dad, or before Dad remarried. She'd reference her mother constantly, keeping Elspeth's ghost alive and present in every conversation. She'd make pointed comments about women who married for money, about trophy wives, about people who attached themselves to successful men instead of building their own legacies. The irony was almost funny. Almost. "You're so lucky you don't have to work," she said once at Thanksgiving dinner when Dashiell was about 10. "Must be nice to just enjoy the fruits of someone else's labor." Gregor's jaw tightened, but I touched his hand under the table, a gentle warning to let it go. "I do miss working sometimes," I said mildly, "but I chose to prioritize family. Different women make different choices." "Of course," Sloan said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My mother worked, even while raising me, even during her illness. She never stopped contributing, never stopped being her own person. but I suppose not everyone has that drive. Dashiell, bless him, was old enough to understand the subtext even at 10. Mom used to run her own company, he said loyally. She imported antiques from Europe. She built it herself from nothing. Used to, Sloane echoed. Past tense. That's the key word, isn't it? I excused myself to check on dinner. In the kitchen, I pressed my hands against the cool marble countertop and took deep breaths. Gregor found me there a few minutes later. I'm going to talk to her, he said, anger making his voice tight. This has gone on long enough. She needs to stop treating you this way. Please don't, I said, turning to face him. It'll only make things worse. She'll just think I complained to you, that I'm trying to turn you against her. She needs to come to acceptance on her own terms, in her own time. It's been over a decade, Callista. How much more time does she need? As much as it takes. I cupped his face gently. I knew what I was signing up for when I married you. A daughter grieving her mother. I can handle Sloane's anger. What I can't handle is you being caught in the middle, forced to choose between us. That would destroy you, and I won't be responsible for that. He pulled me close, holding me tight. You're too patient with her. Too kind. I'm patient because I love you, I said simply, and because despite everything, I understand her pain. I lost my parents young too. I know what it's like to feel like the world took something from you that can never be replaced. What I didn't tell him was how much it hurt, how every casual cruelty landed like a knife, how every dismissal of my worth chipped away at my confidence, how exhausting it was to maintain dignity in the face of constant contempt. I didn't tell him because he had enough to carry. His daughter's unhappiness, his guilt over moving on from Elspeth, his constant attempt to balance two parts of his life that refused to harmonize. So I stayed silent and smiled through the barbs and pretended that Sloane's hatred didn't slowly erode something vital inside me. The comments got worse over the years. When Dashiell graduated high school and started talking about architecture school, Sloane made a pointed remark about how nice it must be to not worry about student loans when you had access to family money. When Gregor bought me diamond earrings for our 15th anniversary, Sloane mentioned how her mother's jewelry had all been family heirlooms, things with actual sentimental value. At Dashiell's college graduation, she cornered me in the ladies' room. You've done well for yourself, she said, reapplying her lipstick in the mirror while I washed my hands. Married a rich widower, had his son, secured your position. Very strategic. I married your father because I loved him, I said quietly. Sure. She snapped her lipstick closed and turned to face me. And the fact that he was worth $100 million was just a happy coincidence. Sloane, what do you want from me? What could I possibly do or say that would make you see me as anything other than what you've decided I am? She studied me for a long moment. Nothing, she said finally. Because you are what I think you are, a woman who saw an opportunity and took it. My father was vulnerable after losing my mother, and you swooped in before he could heal properly. You took advantage of his grief. That's not true. Isn't it? 3 months, Callista. He'd been widowed for 3 months when you met him. Most people wait longer than that to get a new dog, but you decided it was enough time to start planning your financial future. The unfairness of it stole my breath. I wanted to tell her everything. About the $12 million, about saving her father's company, about the fact that I'd had my own wealth and given it all up to protect the empire she thought I was trying to steal. But I'd promised Gregor, and more than that, I knew it wouldn't matter. Sloane had built her entire adult identity around the narrative of the evil stepmother. Facts wouldn't change that. They'd just force her to construct new narratives that fit her existing beliefs. I'm sorry you feel that way, I said instead, and left the bathroom before she could see the tears building in my eyes. When Gregor turned 70, he started talking about mortality, about legacy, about making sure everything was in order. He updated his will, organized his financial documents, made sure all his affairs were transparent and clear. He told me he was leaving me the majority of the estate, 73%, with Sloane and Dashiell splitting the remainder. That's too much, I protested. Sloane already resents me. If I get the majority, she'll spend the rest of her life trying to prove I manipulated you." "You earned it," he said firmly, "not just as my wife, though God knows you've been patient and loving for 17 years, but as my business partner. That $12 million you gave me, Callista, the investment we formalized, you're entitled to the returns on that. The contracts are clear. You own 51% of the company. That's not charity or marital asset division. That's your legal property. But Sloane doesn't know that. When she sees the will, she'll think—" "Then maybe it's time she learns the truth," Gregor interrupted. "Maybe she needs to know that you weren't some gold digger who married me for money, that you had your own fortune and gave it all to save mine." "No," I was adamant. "Gregor, please, not yet. Let her come to terms with your death first. Whenever that happens, God forbid. Let her grieve without having her entire worldview shattered simultaneously. The truth can wait." He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed to compromise. He'd leave documentation in his personal safe, the one in his study that only he and Dashiell knew the combination to. Instructions for Dashiell to open it before the official estate proceedings. That way the truth would come out, but gently, through her brother rather than through lawyers in a cold conference room. "I'm leaving a letter for her too," Gregor said, "explaining everything about the money, about your sacrifice, about how wrong she's been all these years. She deserves to know the truth, Callista, even if it's painful." "And what about the other thing?" I asked quietly. "About Elspeth's treatment?" His face clouded. "That too, all of it, no more secrets." The other thing was something I'd only learned by accident, years after the fact. In 2007, during the final months of Elspeth's life, Gregor had been pursuing experimental treatments. Anything that might save her, might give them more time. The treatments were extraordinarily expensive and not covered by insurance. Immunotherapy protocols being tested in Europe, specialized treatments that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of success. Gregor had spent everything trying to save her. Everything. He'd emptied his reserves, liquidated investments, borrowed against his properties. And when that wasn't enough, when there was one more treatment to try, one more possibility, he'd come to me. We'd been dating for about 8 months. We weren't married yet, weren't even officially engaged. But he was desperate, and I had liquid capital from a recent business deal. He asked to borrow $300,000 for an investment opportunity that couldn't wait. I gave it to him without hesitation. Told him to take whatever time he needed to pay it back, that I trusted him. I didn't find out until 3 years later, when I accidentally saw some old medical bills, that the investment opportunity had been Elspeth's final treatment protocol, the one that gave her 3 more months of life, 3 more months for Sloane to say goodbye to her mother. When I confronted Gregor about it, he'd broken down. "I couldn't ask you directly," he said. "We weren't even married yet. How could I ask my girlfriend to pay for my dying wife's medical care? But I was out of options, Callista. Completely out. And you gave me that money without question, without hesitation, and it bought Elspeth time. It gave my daughter 3 more months with her mother." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked, though I wasn't angry. How could I be angry about money that had given a dying woman more time with her daughter? "Because I was ashamed," he admitted, "and because I knew you'd never hold it over me, never use it as leverage, so what was the point? You'd done this beautiful, generous thing without even knowing it. Telling you felt like it would diminish that somehow." "Does Sloane know?" "No. No one knows except you and me and Richard, because he handled the financial transfer. I never told Elspeth either. She thought the money came from liquidating an investment property. So I'd saved Elspeth, extended her life, given Sloane more time with her mother, and Sloane had spent the last 17 years hating me for being alive when her mother wasn't. The irony was devastating. When Gregor had his first heart attack at 70, Sloane's behavior reached new levels of intensity. She called 3 times a day to check on him, showed up unannounced to take him to doctor's appointments, started making pointed comments about stress and people who created stress in his life, looking directly at me when she said it. "She thinks you're killing him," Dashiell said to me once after a particularly tense family dinner. He was 26 then, working at an architecture firm in Manhattan, coming home most weekends to check on his father. She actually said that to me, that the stress of your marriage is destroying his health. "That's ridiculous," I said, though my hands shook as I cleared the dinner dishes. "Your father is 72 and had high blood pressure for 20 years before I met him. This has nothing to do with stress." "I know that, but Sloan needs someone to blame, and you're the convenient target. You've always been the convenient target." The last 4 years of Gregor's life were a constant battle. Not between him and me, our love was stronger than ever, deepened by time and shared history, but between Sloane's increasing attempts to control her father's life and my attempts to maintain some semblance of normal family dynamics. She tried to get him to update his will, I later learned, brought lawyers to the house, talked about protecting the family legacy, about ensuring the Mountgroff name stayed with the Mountgroff blood. Gregor shut her down firmly, but it drove a wedge between them that never quite healed. At our last Thanksgiving together, 6 months before Gregor died, Sloane brought a friend from work, another public relations executive, a woman named Veronica, who spent the entire meal talking about trophy wives and prenuptial agreements and people who married for money. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Gregor finally lost his temper. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through Veronica's monologue. "Sloane, I've tolerated your behavior for nearly 2 decades because you were grieving your mother and I understood that. But this ends now. Callista is my wife. She's been my partner for 18 years. She's been patient and kind and gracious in the face of treatment that would have driven most people away. And you're going to show her the respect she deserves, or you're going to leave my house." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sloane's face went white, then red. She stood up carefully, folded her napkin with precise movements, and said, "I see. After all these years, you're finally choosing her over me. Mom would be so proud." She left. Didn't come back for 2 months. When she did, she was coldly polite, but refused to apologize. Gregor tried to bridge the gap, but something had broken between them that couldn't be repaired. When Gregor died in his sleep 3 weeks ago, Sloane's first words to me were, "I suppose you're satisfied now." We were standing in his bedroom, his body still in the bed, the paramedics already confirming what we all knew. And she looked at me with such hatred, such absolute conviction that I was somehow responsible for his death, that I couldn't even speak. The funeral was a nightmare. Sloane positioned herself as the chief mourner, the devoted daughter, while treating me like hired help. She chose the music, the flowers, the speakers, all things that should have been my role as his wife. But I let her have it. What did it matter? Gregor was gone. The man I'd loved for 19 years, the man I'd built a life with, the man I'd sacrificed my own identity to support, was gone. Fighting with his daughter over funeral arrangements seemed petty and pointless. But the day after the funeral, when she cornered me in the library and told me I'd be out on the street like a dog with nothing but a death certificate, something in me shifted. Because I'd been patient for 18 years. I'd endured her cruelty with grace. I'd protected her feelings at the expense of my own dignity. But I was done protecting Sloane from the truth. The morning after Sloane's threat, I woke up at 5:30. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours, my mind churning through possibilities, trying to anticipate how the day would unfold. Gregor's instructions had been clear. Dashiell was to open the safe in his study at 8 o'clock, alone, and read everything inside before the lawyer meeting scheduled for 10. I made coffee and sat in the breakfast nook watching the sun rise over the gardens Gregor had tended so carefully. The white roses were still there, browning at the edges now without his attention. Everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable to happen. At 7:45, I heard Dashiell's footsteps on the stairs. He came into the kitchen looking like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair uncombed. He poured himself coffee with shaking hands. "Mom," he said quietly, not looking at me. "Dad left instructions. I'm supposed to open his safe this morning, before the lawyers." "I know," I said gently. He finally looked at me. "You know what's in there, don't you? Whatever it is, whatever he wanted me to find, you already know." "Yes." "Is it bad? Is it something that's going to make everything worse?" I thought about how to answer that. Was truth bad? Was shattering someone's carefully constructed reality a bad thing if that reality was built on lies? Was forcing Sloane to confront the fact that she'd spent 18 years hating someone who'd actually saved her family something that would make things worse or better? "It's going to change everything," I said finally. "But whether that's bad or good, I honestly don't know anymore. Your father thought Sloane deserved to know the truth. I've spent 18 years thinking she was better off not knowing. We'll find out this morning which one of us was right." Dashiell sat down across from me, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug like he needed the warmth. "She said terrible things to you yesterday, about you ending up on the street, about you only getting a death certificate. I wanted to hit her, Mom, my own sister, and I wanted to physically hurt her for how she talked to you." "I know, sweetheart. But violence never solves anything, especially not family pain." "Neither does silence, apparently," he said, and there was an edge to his voice I rarely heard. "You've been silent for 18 years, letting her say whatever she wants, never defending yourself. And she just got crueler. Maybe if you'd fought back, if you'd told her the truth years ago, things would be different now." "Maybe," I admitted. "Or maybe she would have just found new ways to twist the truth into something that fit her narrative. We'll never know because I made the choice I thought was right at the time, the choice your father asked me to make." At 7:55, Dashiell stood up. "I should go. Dad said to read everything before the meeting. If there's a lot of documents, I'll need time." "Dashiell," I said as he reached the kitchen door, "whatever you find in there, whatever you read, remember that your father loved both you and Sloane more than anything. Everything he did, including keeping secrets, was because he was trying to protect both his children in different ways." He nodded and left. I sat there listening to his footsteps fade, then the sound of the study door closing. For 15 minutes, there was silence. I sipped my coffee and watched the light change in the garden and tried to prepare myself for what was coming. Then I heard the scream. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a horror movie scream or a scream of physical pain. It was worse than that. It was the sound of someone's soul breaking. The sound of everything you believed about your life suddenly revealed as false. I'd heard that sound once before, when I was 20 and my aunt called to tell me my parents had been killed by a drunk driver. The sound of your reality shattering completely. I set down my coffee cup carefully and walked toward the study. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I kept my breathing steady, my steps measured. Whatever was happening in that room, Dashiell needed me to be calm. He needed me to be the stable parent, the one who could hold things together while his world fell apart. The study door was open. Dashiell was sitting on the floor surrounded by documents. His hands were literally in his hair, pulling at it, tears streaming down his face. Papers were scattered around him, bank statements, legal contracts, letters in his father's handwriting. The safe stood open behind him, empty now, all its secrets spilled across the hardwood floor. "Mom," he whispered when he saw me. His voice was raw, broken. "Mom, you need to see this. Sloane needs to see this. She doesn't know. Oh God, she has no idea what she's done." I knelt beside him, my knees protesting the hard floor, and started gathering papers. The first thing I picked up was the investment contract from 2008. $12 million transferred from my personal account to Mount Groff Development Corporation. The contract giving me 51% equity in exchange. The documentation showing that without that capital injection, the company would have declared bankruptcy within 30 days. The second thing was a letter from Gregor, pages and pages in his careful handwriting. I could see where Dashiell had been reading, his tears staining the paper in places. The letter was addressed to both his children, but it was clear from the content that it was primarily meant for Sloane. "My dearest Sloane," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I need you to know some things that I should have told you years ago, but didn't because I was trying to protect you. Or maybe I was trying to protect myself from your pain. Either way, my silence was wrong, and I'm sorry for it." The letter went on to explain everything. The financial crisis of 2008, my investment that saved the company, the legal structure that made me majority owner, not through marriage, but through legitimate business investment. The fact that I'd built my own fortune before ever meeting him, that I'd been financially independent and successful, that I'd given it all up, not to trap him, but to save him. And then, in the final pages, the thing that would destroy Sloane completely. The truth about her mother's final treatment, the $300,000 that gave Elspeth 3 more months of life. The fact that I'd paid for it without knowing what it was for, that I'd given Sloane more time with her mother without ever asking for recognition or gratitude. "You've spent 18 years hating the wrong person," Gregor had written. "Callista didn't take anything from you. She gave you everything and asked for nothing in return. She gave you time with your mother. She gave you financial security when this family was on the brink of losing everything. She gave you patience and grace and kindness, even when you treated her with cruelty. And she did it all in silence because I asked her to. I told her that you needed space to grieve, that you needed to work through your anger, that someday you'd come around on your own. I was wrong, Sloane. You didn't need space. You needed truth. And I denied you that truth because I was a coward who couldn't face your anger. I chose my own comfort over your growth, and I'm sorry. Callista deserved better from both of us. She deserved better from me for not defending her publicly, and she deserved better from you for the simple crime of loving your father and being kind to his daughter. Please don't make my final legacy be the destruction of my family. Please find a way to forgive her for the sin of being alive when your mother isn't. Please find a way to forgive yourself for the years you wasted on hatred. Please find a way to forgive me for not being brave enough to tell you this while I was alive." Dashiell was shaking as I read, his breathing ragged. "How do I tell her?" he asked. "How do I show her this? It's going to destroy her, Mom. Everything she's believed about you, about Dad, about herself. It's all wrong. Her entire adult identity is built on a lie." "I don't know," I said honestly. "But your father wanted her to know. And maybe he was right. Maybe the truth, even when it's devastating, is better than living in a comfortable lie." "She called you a dog yesterday," Dashiell said, his voice breaking again. "She said you'd end up on the street with nothing but a death certificate. And the whole time, you owned more of Dad's company than anyone. You saved everything she thinks she's fighting for." I gathered the papers carefully, organizing them into neat stacks. The contracts, the bank statements, the letter. All the proof that I wasn't what Sloane had spent 18 years believing I was. All the evidence that would shatter her reality completely. "The lawyer meeting is in 90 minutes, I said quietly. "We need to decide how to handle this. Do we show her privately first, just us? Or do we let it come out in the official proceedings?" Dashiell looked at me with his father's eyes, full of pain and confusion and a desperate need for guidance. "What do you want to do, Mom? You're the one who's been hurt by all of this. You're the one who deserves justice. What do you want?" What did I want? Revenge, vindication. To watch Sloane's face as she realized how wrong she'd been? Or did I want what I'd always wanted? A family that could love each other without the poison of secrets and lies between them. "I want the truth," I said finally. "Whatever that costs, whatever it breaks, I want the truth to finally be told." We decided to let Sloane see the documents before the official meeting. It felt cruel to blindside her in front of lawyers and witnesses, no matter how much she'd earned public humiliation with her behavior. Dashiell called her at 8:45 and asked her to come early, told her there was something she needed to see before the estate proceedings began. She arrived at 9:15, dressed in a sharp black Armani suit like she was preparing for battle. She had her own lawyer with her, a woman named Patricia Brennan who specialized in contesting estates. I recognized her from articles in legal journals, profiles about her aggressive tactics in family wealth disputes. She was expensive and ruthless, exactly the kind of representation you'd want if you were planning to challenge your father's will. They came into the formal dining room where Dashiell and I were waiting. I'd laid out all the documents on the long mahogany table in organized sections. The investment contracts on the left, the bank statements in the middle, Gregor's letter on the right. Everything illuminated by the morning sun streaming through the tall windows. Sloane stopped when she saw the papers. Something in her face shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features before her usual armor snapped back into place. "What is this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Some kind of ambush before the official meeting?" "It's the truth," Dashiell said quietly. He looked exhausted, his eyes still red from crying. "Dad left instructions for me to open his personal safe this morning. This is what was inside. He wanted you to see it, Sloane. He wanted you to know." Patricia stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the documents on the table. "I'd advise my client not to review any materials without proper legal context and—" "I'm not your client yet," Sloane interrupted, "and this is my father's personal safe we're talking about. Whatever he left is meant for family, not lawyers." She looked at me directly for the first time since entering the room. "Though I'm surprised she's here. This seems like it should be private." "Mom has every right to be here," Dashiell said, and there was steel in his voice now. "Actually, once you read what Dad left, you'll understand that she has more right to be here than anyone." Sloane's eyes narrowed, but she walked to the table. Patricia followed, hovering protectively. Sloane picked up the first document, an investment contract dated October 15th, 2008. I watched her face as she read, saw the moment comprehension started to dawn. Her brow furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "This says Callista transferred $12 million to Dad's company. That can't be right. She didn't have $12 million. She was just an antique dealer. She sold her business in 2007, Dashiell said, for $14 million. Dad invested $2 million for her. She kept $12 million in liquid assets." He paused. "Until Dad's company was about to go bankrupt in 2008. Then she gave him everything she had to save it." Sloane looked at me, her face pale. "That's not possible. You never worked. You retired when you married Dad. You didn't have money of your own." "I chose to step back from my business," I said quietly. "That's not the same as not having money. I sold my company for $14 million, Sloane. I was financially independent before I ever married your father. And when he needed help, I gave him every penny I had to save the company you're now trying to claim as your inheritance." Patricia picked up the contract, reading through it quickly with practiced efficiency. I saw her face change as she understood what she was looking at. "These are legitimate investment contracts," she said to Sloane. "Properly executed, witnessed, notarized. Your father gave your stepmother 51% equity in Mount Groff Development Corporation in exchange for a capital injection of $12 million. She looked up. "This isn't a marital asset to be divided. This is direct ownership. She's the majority shareholder." "No," Sloane said, but her voice was shaking now. "No, that's not. Dad wouldn't have—" She grabbed more papers, the bank statements showing the transfers, the corporate documents establishing the ownership structure. Her hands were trembling so badly the papers rattled. "There's more," Dashiell said gently. He picked up Gregor's letter and held it out to her. "Dad wrote this for you, for both of us, but mostly for you. He wanted you to understand." Sloane took the letter like it might burn her. She sat down heavily in one of the dining chairs and started to read. I watched her face, saw every emotion play across it in waves: confusion, disbelief, shock. And then, as she got to the section about her mother's treatment, something that looked like physical pain. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and horrified. "You paid for my mother's final treatment? The immunotherapy in Switzerland? That was you?" "I didn't know that's what it was for," I said, my own voice thick with emotion now. "Your father told me he needed money for an investment opportunity. I gave it to him. I only found out years later that he'd used it for your mother's medical care." $300,000, Sloane read from the letter, her voice breaking. $300,000 that gave Mom 3 more months. 3 more months that I got to say goodbye, that I got to tell her I loved her, that I got to... She stopped, pressing her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face now. Patricia touched Sloane's shoulder. "Perhaps we should take a break. This is clearly very emotional. And get out," Sloane said. "I'm sorry? Get out." Sloane's voice was stronger now, though tears were still falling. "You're not my lawyer. I don't need a lawyer. I need... She couldn't finish. She just shook her head and gestured toward the door. Patricia looked uncertain, but she gathered her briefcase and left, closing the dining room door quietly behind her. The 3 of us sat there in silence for a long moment. Sloane was still holding the letter, but she wasn't reading anymore. She was just staring at it like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. 18 years, she finally said. "I've spent 18 years hating you. 18 years believing you were a gold digger who trapped my father. 18 years thinking you married him for money when you actually gave him your own fortune." She looked up at me, her face destroyed. "And you never said anything. You let me think the worst of you. You let me treat you like garbage, and you never once defended yourself." "Your father asked me not to," I said. "He thought you needed time to grieve. He thought that telling you would just make you feel obligated to be grateful, and he didn't want that. He wanted you to come to acceptance on your own." "Well, I didn't," Sloane said bitterly. "I never came to acceptance. I just got angrier and meaner and more convinced that I was right." She pressed her hands over her face. "Oh God, the things I said to you. Yesterday, in the library, I called you a dog. I said you'd end up on the street with nothing but a death certificate." "I know. And the whole time, you owned more of Dad's company than he did. You were the majority shareholder. You could have destroyed me at any moment, could have thrown those contracts in my face, could have humiliated me in front of everyone, and you just stayed quiet." "What would that have accomplished?" I asked. "Making you feel small? Proving I was right and you were wrong? That wouldn't have fixed anything, Sloane. It would have just created more pain." She shook her head slowly, tears still falling. "I don't understand you. I've never understood you. What kind of person accepts that kind of treatment? What kind of person lets someone hate them for something they didn't do and never fights back?" "The kind of person who loved your father enough to protect his relationship with his daughter," I said simply, "even at the cost of my own dignity, even when it hurt, because Gregor had already lost one love. I wasn't going to be the reason he lost his daughter, too." Dashiell had been quiet through all of this, but now he spoke. "Sloane, there's something else in the letter, something about you and how Dad felt about everything." Sloane looked down at the pages again, finding the section Dashiell meant. She read aloud, her voice breaking on almost every word. "I chose my own comfort over your growth, and I'm sorry. Callista deserved better from both of us. She deserved better from me for not defending her publicly, and she deserved better from you for the simple crime of loving your father and being kind to his daughter." She stopped, pressing the letter against her chest. He knew how I treated you, and he thought it was his fault for not stopping it." "It wasn't his fault," I said. "It wasn't anyone's fault. You were grieving. People in pain lash out. I understood that." "Stop it," Sloane said suddenly, her voice sharp. Stop being so understanding. Stop being so patient and kind and gracious. You have every right to be angry with me, every right to hate me for what I've put you through, so stop pretending like it's all okay, like I haven't spent nearly 2 decades making your life miserable. I'm not pretending, I said. I'm just choosing not to let your anger define my life. Yes, you hurt me. Yes, there were times I cried myself to sleep because of things you said. Yes, I questioned whether staying in this family was worth the constant pain. But I also chose to stay. I chose to believe that eventually, somehow, things might get better. Maybe that was naive. Maybe it was stupid. But it was my choice, and I don't regret it. Sloane stared at me for a long moment. Then she stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to us. Her shoulders were shaking. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. My mother died when I was 16. For 2 years before that, I watched her waste away, watched cancer destroy her piece by piece. She was so strong, so brave, but at the end, she was just this tiny, fragile thing that barely looked human anymore. And Dad was devastated, completely destroyed. He tried to hide it from me, tried to be strong, but I could see him breaking. She turned to face us, tears streaming down her face openly now. When Mom died, I thought Dad would never recover. I thought we'd both just exist in this house like ghosts, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. And then 3 months later, he meets you at some auction in London, and suddenly he's smiling again, laughing again, planning a future again, and I hated you for that. I hated that you could make him happy when Mom couldn't anymore. When I couldn't anymore. Sloane, I said gently, but she held up a hand to stop me. No, let me finish. I built my entire adult identity around hating you, around believing that you were this evil person who'd taken advantage of my father's grief. It was easier than accepting that maybe Dad deserved to be happy again. Maybe he deserved love after losing Mom. Maybe his life didn't have to end just because hers did. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. And I was so convinced I was right, so absolutely certain that I was protecting Dad's legacy, protecting Mom's memory, protecting our family from an interloper. I never once questioned my own narrative, never once considered that I might be wrong. She walked back to the table and picked up the letter again. He says here that I wasted years on hatred. He's right. I wasted so much time, so much energy. And for what? To protect myself from having to admit that my mother was gone and life kept going anyway? To avoid the guilt of being happy when she couldn't be? Dashiell stood up and went to his sister. He put his arms around her, and she collapsed against him, sobbing. Really sobbing now, not the controlled tears from before, but deep, wrenching sobs that sounded like they were being torn from her chest. He held her and let her cry, and I sat there watching my stepchildren mourn together. Mourning their father, yes, but also mourning the lost years, the wasted opportunities, the family they could have been if grief hadn't poisoned everything. After several minutes, Sloane pulled away from Dashiell. She took a shaky breath and looked at me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. For every cruel word, for every dismissive look, for 18 years of making you feel like you didn't belong in your own home. You deserve so much better than what I gave you. I stood up and walked around the table to where she stood. For a moment, I just looked at her. This woman who'd made my life so difficult for so long. This woman who was also a broken daughter grieving her parents. This woman who was young and scared and human underneath all that anger. Then I pulled her into my arms. She stiffened at first, shocked. Then she wrapped her arms around me and started crying again. Quieter now, but just as deep. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm so sorry. I know, I said, holding her tight. I know you are. We stood there for a long time, the three of us, in that dining room filled with documents that told the truth of our family's history. The truth that Gregor had kept hidden to protect his daughter's feelings. The truth that I'd kept hidden to protect his relationship with her. The truth that had finally come out not because either of us chose to reveal it, but because a dying man had decided his children deserved better than comfortable lies. When we finally pulled apart, Sloane's makeup was ruined, her eyes red and swollen. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable, like the grief had stripped away years of armor. "What happens now?" she asked. "The lawyer meeting is in 30 minutes. Do we still go through with everything? The will reading and the estate division?" "That's up to you," I said. "The will is clear. I get 73%. You and Dashiell split the remainder. But that was based on your father's wishes, not on the legal reality of ownership. Legally, I already own 51% of the company through the investment contracts. The will is just distributing the remaining assets and his personal 49%. So you don't need the will," Sloane said slowly, understanding dawning. "You're already the majority owner. You could contest it, could demand your full contractual ownership, and I'd end up with even less than Dad wanted me to have." "I could," I agreed, "but I'm not going to. Your father wanted you to have 15%. He wanted Dashiell to have 12. I'm going to honor that, not because I'm legally obligated to, but because I loved him, and I want to respect his wishes." Sloane closed her eyes. "You're giving me 15% of a company you saved, 15% of something that wouldn't even exist if you hadn't given up your own fortune. And you're doing it because it's what Dad wanted, even though I told you yesterday that you'd end up with nothing." "Yes. Why?" The question came out raw, desperate. "Why would you do that after everything I've done to you?" I thought about how to answer that. About all the complicated reasons and emotions that had brought us to this moment. But in the end, the truth was simple. "Because you're Gregor's daughter," I said, "and he loved you, and that's enough." The lawyer meeting was almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened in the dining room. Patricia Brennan was dismissed, much to her obvious displeasure. Richard walked us through the will with professional efficiency, but everyone in that conference room could feel that something fundamental had shifted. Sloane sat beside me instead of across from me, and when Richard explained the asset distribution, she didn't challenge a single item. "I'd like to propose an amendment," Sloane said when Richard finished. Her voice was hoarse from crying, but steady. "My father left me 15% of his share of the company. I'd like to transfer an additional 5% of that to Callista, bringing her total to 78%. Richard looked startled. "Ms. Cavendish, I have to advise you that this is a significant financial decision. Perhaps you should take some time to consider—" "I don't need time," Sloane interrupted. "My father built that company, but Callista saved it. She deserves the majority. She already legally owns 51% through her investment contracts, and Dad clearly wanted her to have more. I'm just honoring what should have been obvious all along." "Sloane, you don't have to do this," I said quietly. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Yes, I do. Not because you're asking me to, but because it's right, and because I've spent 18 years doing the wrong thing. I'd like to start fixing that now." We finalized the estate paperwork. The mansion in Greenwich would remain in my name. Gregor's personal investments would be divided according to his wishes. His vintage car collection would go to Dashiell, who'd always loved them. His mother's jewelry, which I'd never worn out of respect for Elspeth's memory, would go to Sloane. After the meeting, the three of us returned to the house. It felt different somehow, like the weight that had been pressing down on us for years had finally lifted. We sat in the living room, drinking coffee, not quite sure what to say to each other now that the crisis had passed. "I want to tell you about my mother," Sloane said suddenly. "The real her, not the saint I invented in my head. Would you want to hear that?" "Yes," I said. "I would very much like to hear about Elspeth." So Sloane talked. She told me about her mother's terrible sense of direction, how she'd get lost driving to places she'd been 100 times, about her awful cooking, which Gregor had tolerated with good-natured humor, about her fierce intelligence and sharper temper, about the arguments she and Gregor used to have about politics and art, about how she'd been funny and flawed and human, not the perfect martyr Sloane had needed her to be. "I think I turned her into a weapon," Sloane admitted, "against you, against Dad moving on, against change. Every time I talked about how perfect she was, how irreplaceable, I was really just trying to convince myself that losing her didn't mean life had to continue, that we could all just freeze in that moment of grief forever." "Grief is complicated," I said. "There's no right way to do it." "Maybe not, but there are definitely wrong ways, and spending 18 years hating my father's wife because she wasn't my dead mother, that was pretty definitively wrong." We spent the afternoon going through old photos. Sloane brought down boxes from her room, pictures of Elspeth and Gregor and a young Sloane before cancer entered their lives. I saw the family they'd been, the happiness they'd shared, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder looking at someone else's life. I felt like I was learning about the woman whose final months I'd inadvertently extended, whose daughter I'd tried so hard to connect with, whose husband I'd loved for nearly 2 decades. "She would have liked you," Sloane said quietly, looking at a photo of Elspeth laughing at some long-forgotten joke. "If she'd lived, if she'd gotten better and you'd met her somehow, she would have liked you. You're both practical, both strong, both willing to sacrifice for the people you love." "Ma," she looked up at me. "I think that's partly why I hated you so much. You reminded me of her in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. It was easier to make you the villain than to accept that Dad had found someone similar to the woman he'd lost." Over the next few weeks, Sloane came to the house more often, not just for business discussions about the company, but for dinner, for conversation, for what felt like the beginnings of an actual relationship. It was awkward sometimes. Years of hostility couldn't be undone overnight, and there were moments when old patterns would surface. A sharp comment, a defensive reaction. But we were trying. Both of us were genuinely trying. One evening, about a month after the will reading, Sloane arrived with a large, wrapped package. "I want to give you something," she said. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I think it's time." Inside was a portrait of Elspeth, a beautiful oil painting that had hung in Sloane's apartment for years. Elspeth was sitting in a garden, sunlight in her hair, smiling at something beyond the frame. She looked happy and alive and real. "I can't take this," I said, shocked. "Sloane, this is your mother. This should stay with you." "I have dozens of photos," Sloane said. "And this house was her home before it was yours. She should be here, not hidden away like she's a secret or a source of shame. She was part of this family's history, and she deserves to be acknowledged." She paused. "And I think I need to see her here, in a home where she's honored rather than weaponized. Does that make sense?" "Yes," I said softly. "It makes perfect sense." We hung the portrait in the library, where Gregor used to read in the evenings. Elspeth watched over the room now with her gentle smile, and somehow it felt right. Not like a ghost haunting us, but like a presence blessing us. The first wife and the second wife, no longer enemies, but women who'd both loved the same man, both sacrificed for the same family, both deserved to be remembered with respect. Dashiell started bringing his girlfriend around more often, a bright young architect named Sarah. At family dinners, I watched Sloane interact with her brother's partner with warmth and welcome, such a contrast to how she'd treated me. Part of me felt a pang at that, a reminder of what could have been if things had been different. But mostly I felt hope. Hope that Sloane was healing, that she was learning from her mistakes, that the next generation of this family might not inherit our wounds. 3 months after Gregor's death, Sloane came to me with a business proposal. She wanted to expand Mount Groff development into sustainable urban housing, a project that would honor her father's legacy while addressing modern needs. It would require significant capital investment and risk, but the potential impact was enormous. "I'd like you to be actively involved," she said. "Not just as majority shareholder, but as a partner. You built a successful business once. You have experience I don't have. And I think we could do something meaningful together. Something Dad would be proud of." I looked at this woman who'd hated me for so long, who was now asking me to work beside her, to build something together. And I thought about Gregor, about how he'd wanted nothing more than for his family to be whole, for his daughter and his wife to find peace with each other. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that very much." The business partnership gave us something concrete to focus on, a shared purpose beyond just trying to repair the past. We met weekly to discuss strategy, toured potential properties together, argued about design choices and financing structures. The arguments were different now, though. They were professional disagreements between equals, not personal attacks meant to wound. 6 months after Gregor died, on what would have been our 19th wedding anniversary, I found a letter on my pillow, Sloane's handwriting. "Dear Callista," it read, "I've tried to write this a dozen times, and I keep failing to find the right words. There aren't words adequate to apologize for 18 years of cruelty. There aren't words that can give back the time I stole from you, the peace I denied you, the family connection you deserved. But I'm going to keep trying anyway, for the rest of my life if necessary, to show you through actions what I can't express through words. You gave my mother 3 more months. You gave my father salvation when his company was dying. You gave me patience and grace when I deserved neither. And now, I'd like to give you something in return. A family. Not the one we should have been all along, but the one we can still become. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when we gave you every reason to. Thank you for staying silent when silence cost you so much. Thank you for being strong enough to forgive what I'm not sure I could have forgiven. You may have come into this family as a stranger, but you've earned your place here through more than just marriage. You've earned it through sacrifice and love and a generosity of spirit that I'm still learning to understand. I'm proud to call you family. I'm grateful to call you my stepmother. And I hope, someday, I'll be worthy of calling you my friend. With love and respect, Sloane." I sat on the bed Gregor and I had shared for 18 years, holding my stepdaughter's letter, and cried. Not tears of pain this time, but tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future I'd almost stopped believing was possible. The house in Greenwich felt like home now, in a way it never quite had before. Not because Sloane's acceptance had finally validated my place here, but because I'd learned something crucial over these months of healing. My worth had never depended on her approval. My value had never been measured by whether she chose to see it. I had always been exactly who I was, a woman who'd built her own fortune, who'd sacrificed it to save the man she loved, who'd endured years of cruelty with dignity and tact, who'd owned 51% of an empire while everyone assumed she owned nothing. Gregor had known my worth. I'd known my worth. And now, finally, Sloane knew it too. But the real gift wasn't her acknowledgement. The real gift was that after all the pain and silence and secrets, we'd found our way to truth. And truth, even when it came 18 years too late, even when it shattered comfortable lies, even when it cost us more than we'd imagined, was still better than the alternative. I'd stayed silent when I was called a gold digger. I'd stayed silent when I was treated like an intruder. I'd stayed silent when I was threatened with ending up on the street like a dog with nothing but a death certificate. And my silence hadn't been weakness. It had been strategy. It had been love. It had been the choice to let truth speak for itself when the time was right. The time had been right, the truth had spoken, and we'd all survived it, scarred perhaps, but healing, finally healing. That was worth more than any inheritance, any percentage of ownership, any vindication could ever be. That was worth 18 years of waiting. That was worth everything.